and welcome to the video, What Drives a Premium Valuation, Part 1. This is a big enough topic that we wanted to break it out into two different videos. In this first part, we're going to talk through the key financial factors that drive a premium valuation. And then we're also going to talk about a sensitive topic, and that is that the value of your business is actually not based on the past, but based on its future. We'll talk about what do we actually mean by the word premium. What are some of those pillars of a premium valuation? What's the difference between what we call input metrics and output metrics? And then finally, how and why your valuation is based on the future, not the past. Okay, well, we're going to focus on the economics in this video. It's important to recognize that premium in a premium valuation sense actually means three things, not one. Most first-time sellers will over-focus on the first one, but people that have sold their business will tell you that the other ones matter a lot and almost maybe even more. The first one is the economics. It's typically over-focused on and usually over-focused on what's called the initial multiple. I sold my company for a 4x multiple or a 5x. But unless you know how the deal was structured, how much was contingent versus guaranteed, etc., you really have no basis for understanding whether or not a seller took a good deal or not. The second one is the strategic fit. And while not discussed in this video, it has everything to do with the culture, the fit, the match of capabilities, and the synergies with a buyer. This one's absolutely critical if you're going to stay on the business for any length of time. It gets more important the longer you stay, but it's also extremely critical even if you're not planning on staying on a long time, because it's the ability to understand what the buyer is going to be able to do with your business that might be the key determinant of whether or not you're going to hit any future compensation payments or not. And then we'll talk about in another video premium terms. The lack of understanding of how much negotiation that there still is left in the LOI and after the LOI is signed is huge. There's dozens and dozens of detailed terms that you need in order to protect yourself adequately, and your goal shouldn't be just to get premium economics or even have a premium strategic fit, but also make sure that you're adequately protected by having premium terms as well. Okay. We'll talk now about the valuation pillars. I call that the 20-20-20 rule. The first thing is that you need to have strong profit margins. And while this varies by category, start thinking of EBITDA or SDE north of 20% as being a strong margin. 20% growth in e-commerce I like to refer to as flat. Now that varies by type of market, type of year. Again, all of this information is going to have some niche or category specific. But these are small companies that are expected to be growth companies in the scheme of private equity. So you need to have 20% margins, 20% year-over-year growth. The next one is the 20% diversification rule, which basically means try not to have more than 20% of your revenue tied up in any one SKU. And then once you have the 20-20-20 down as guidelines, think about it this way, that if you can achieve higher growth on higher earnings, that's actually harder. Therefore, you'll be more likely, for example, if you have $2 million of earnings, that's growing at 20% versus $200,000 of earnings, that's growing at 20%. So those are the financial criteria. But then there's things that come into play, such as recurring revenue, or how easy is it to take the business over, or how strong is the brand, or what's my track record in business. And what I want to separate out for you is the separation between things like strong brand are only relevant to the extent that eventually they drive financial pillars such as these. There's a number of sellers out there that have tried to create a strong brand off of Amazon. They spent a lot of money on, for example, a Shopify site and all of those things, which I'm not saying don't do. But at the end of the day, it proved not to really help their business because it brought in a bunch of sales that weren't profitable. So these other types of things, in order for them to lead to a premium valuation, they should eventually tie to some aspect of the pillars of premium valuation. Okay, so now that you know what the pillars are, I want you to start thinking about your business as what I call the engine of the car versus the dashboard. So the engine are input numbers, things like how many sessions am I getting? Can I drive my sessions up? What's my conversion rate? Can I optimize my listing to improve that? What's my contribution margin? Can I renegotiate with suppliers to improve my contribution margin? And or can I create lists or pixels or opt-ins with different types of customers to drive more sales coming in? That will lead to output numbers, which will be things like your historical profitability in your financial statements. It might be ratios of your growth percentages. It might be help your pro formas, and it might actually look good on graphs or different types of multiples. But one of them is the driver of the car, and the second one is output numbers that are useful for calculating your valuation, but they're not useful for determining how valuable it is. The important point to recognize is when you understand where your business is going from a driver's perspective, you can now start to understand where the premium economics of your deal can come from. And there's two different and related ways that a seller and a buyer are going to look at it. From the seller's perspective, I want to introduce the concept of what's called a lifetime effective multiple. In essence, it means not just what did I get paid cash at closing, which is an important number, but if I added up all of the deal payments that I got from my cash, my stabilization payments, my earnouts, my rolled equity, and I subtracted all of the claims that maybe I had a liability claim against from an employee, there was a net amount of cash that I generated. And when I drive that against the trailing 12 months SDE that I have, I can calculate 3-4 years in the future maybe, what was the lifetime effective multiple of this particular transaction? Most sellers don't put near enough focus when they're negotiating a deal on understanding the lifetime effective multiple, and that may cause them to take a deal that might have a 4x cash at closing when they could have taken a deal that would have had a 3.75 cash at closing, but a real opportunity to get to a 5x. And so you have to look at the risks and the trade-offs and ultimately make an assessment of what's the lifetime effective multiple between two buyers that I might be considering. From the buyer perspective, they kind of look at it a little bit differently. But if you think about lifetime effective multiple, you add up your lifetime deal payments, you take away your claims, and then you've achieved the lifetime effective multiple for the business. Okay, now let's talk about the buyer perspective. I call this the buyer's effective multiple because what you do in this situation is you have to look at it on future cash flow. Remember, the buyer is paying you with after-tax cash dollars, so their return is going to be calculated by cash flow, not just seller's discretionary earnings. And as we just said, they don't get any of your money that you had historically, so they're looking at the future, not the past. They're going to also have to look at what is the cash that they get when they sell it, not just the cash of when they operate it, because that's a key part of their return. And finally, when they take the net cash generated divided by the trailing 12 months earnings, and they understand what the amount was that they paid, they're going to be able to determine a buyer's effective multiple. Now, in practice, buyers use something called IRR and other types of analysis, but I wanted to relate it to a multiple so that we can start to see the relationship between you as the seller and the buyer. Here's one of the biggest exit strategy myths that I've found that has been out there, and you've probably heard it. It's called buyers only buy based on historical earnings. Nothing could be further from the truth. Trailing 12 months earnings is only the way that businesses are calculated, much like we might say that the temperature is in Fahrenheit, but that is not the way that they are evaluated, whether it's hot or cold. It's absolutely critical for you to understand this because eventually your business, you'll look at your business when you get your offer and it'll say, I paid you 4 times TTM earnings. And so you'll think, well, that's how they valued me. No, that's how they converted the value of that business into a calculation metric. But it's important to understand they buy based on your future earnings, not your past. So every time that you hear a buyer that might say, we only buy based on historical earnings, you're going to have to ask the question, is that really true? And here's why it's not. Simple. How many historical dollars that you have made does the buyer get to receive? And the answer is 0. The profit that you have from your business that you use to blow on traveling the world, as I always like to say, is gone. They don't get a dime of that. So the only dollars that matter to them are the dollars that are after the transaction, which means the only calculation that they're trying to determine is how many future dollars are they going to get against how many dollars they have to pay you upfront or over time. It doesn't get any simpler than that. So you might go, well, wait a minute, Scott, if it's all based on the future value of it, then why does everybody use trailing 12 months as a way to quote unquote value my business, or as I like to say, calculate your business? Well, the first answer is simply this. If a company like yours is growing and it's going to have a bigger number in the future than in the past, if you were on the buy side, would you rather show a bigger number by using a historical model rather than a future? Because if you're doubling the earnings of your company every year, is it more exciting to say, I'm willing to pay you 5 times trailing earnings, or to say, I'm going to end up paying you 2 times or 2.5 times mathematically your next 12 months earnings? Well, the answer is pretty obvious. But beyond that, it also has to do with safety and the ability to calculate risk. If I'm a buyer, what I do know and what I can justify to my board or my investment committee is what it has done in the past. It's an entirely different thing to be able to obviously accurately determine what the future is. That doesn't mean that it's not worthwhile to do it. It just means that because it's safer for buyers to think in terms of historical, they may offer you something based on historical. But again, that does not mean that that is the way that you're valued. And the simplest way I can put it is to think like a buyer for 1 minute, assume the risks is the same in 2 different businesses, and now let's look at which company would you rather buy. You've got a decision. You can buy company A, which has $1 million of earnings, and it's projected to grow at 10% per year, and it's only grown at 10% per year for the last 3 years. Or you can buy business B, $1 million, same of earnings, but it's growing at 50% per year, and it has a bunch of new products in the pipeline that shows me that it's going to continue to grow at 50% per year after you own it, because remember, now you're the buyer. Well, the answer is obvious. You're going to want the business that has more future potential. Or, as I like to say, if you don't present an exciting future forecast for your business, you are leaving money on the table. Thanks for watching part 1, where we talked about that a premium valuation is not just as simple as the historical earnings, but you're also going to have to look at the future potential of that business. And ultimately, the definition of a win is not just the money you get up front, but the lifetime effective multiple of your deal. Thank you.